Level 1, 2, 3 and 4 controls are all about preventing an accident occurring. Level 5 controls are fundamentally different. A level 5 control is about using an incident to prevent it happening again. So level 5 controls are about understanding what incidents within the workplace are fatigue related and to use that information in order to prevent them reoccurring. So there's a couple of things that are important to understand when we're talking about level 5 controls. And the first is that they are about identifying whether an accident is fatigue related. And while that may sound on the surface a relatively simple thing to answer, it's actually not. Many organisations struggle to determine whether an accident is fatigue related or not. Many regulatory agencies suffer from the same problem. For example, in a number of states in Australia, an accident can only be fatigue related if the driver reports falling asleep at the time of the accident. That means if the driver dies in the accident, it can't by definition be a fatigue related accident. Similarly, in a number of states in Australia, for an accident to be considered fatigue related, it must happen more than 200 kilometres from the GPO of the capital city. I won't go into the historical reasons for this, but just suffice it to say that because accidents that are fatigue related typically occur on long country roads a long way from the capital city, people have used that to define whether an accident is fatigue related, and as a consequence they reach some somewhat illogical conclusions. So, as it stands in several states in Australia, if an accident is within 100 or 200 kilometres of the GPO, it can't be fatigue related either. There's a number of things that an organisation can do to determine the likelihood that an accident is fatigue related. And again, the levels of control that we've outlined in this model provide a systematic manner for you to go through the event and try to understand whether the event is potentially fatigue related or not. There are two logical conditions that must hold if we want to consider an accident as fatigue related. The first is that there must be level 1, 2 or 3 evidence of an increased likelihood of fatigue. That is, if you look at an incident and you look at the investigation of the incident, what was the sleep opportunity? That is, what was the level 1 data provided as to whether the individual had been provided an adequate opportunity. In general, we would suggest that you would need approximately a week or 2 of data prior to the accident on the shifts that that individual had worked. An analysis of the level 1 data will determine whether the individual was given an adequate opportunity to rest and recover, but it won't tell you whether the individual actually got sufficient sleep. The next level of the analysis would be to try and understand what the sleep-wake behaviour in that individual was in the 2 or 3 days immediately preceding the accident. Now, depending on the seriousness of the accident and the forensic availability of evidence, it may be simple or complicated to do that. In many cases, an individual may choose not to answer the questions about that because they may reserve the right to not self-incriminate. But where the accidents are significant, and particularly where there's been a fatality involved, then organisations will often spend considerable time establishing the facts at level 2. I've been involved in a number of court cases recently where the state has spent upwards of $1 million checking somebody's mobile phone records, their credit card receipts, the video recordings on the road to establish where and when they were driving and when they were at home. Once your friends realise that they could be called into court to give evidence on what time you guys left the pub, and that there will be video evidence of you going in and out of the pub, and that the perjury is a criminal offence, all of a sudden proving that you were actually in bed asleep becomes a little bit more difficult than many people would imagine. Increasingly in court cases, the forensic examination of evidence is focusing on whether that individual was likely to have obtained sleep and what evidence there is that the individual actually obtained sleep in the days prior to the accident. All of those factors at level 1, 2 and 3 go to determining the likelihood of fatigue. So if we look at the level 3 evidence, Was there symptoms or signs of fatigue? Often in a trucking accident, you will see somebody say, I was driving behind that car before the accident and they were wandering all over the road. They veered to the right, they veered to the left. In many cases, there are behavioural indicators that are consistent with the individual being fatigued. People will often comment that the person looked like death warmed up on that day, or they came in and they looked really doughy, or whatever the expression might be. But a systematic examination of level 1, 2 and 3 data should enable you to make a reasonable conclusion as to the likelihood that the individual was or was not fatigued. In the event that you cannot provide level 1, 2 or 3 evidence, then you cannot conclude that the accident isn't, or that the likelihood is that that individual was or was not fatigued. The second logical condition that needs to hold true for level 5 controls is that for an accident to be fatigue related, the error that caused the accident has to be typical for a fatigue related error in that task. And as simple as that may sound, it's not. We have an experiment that we used to do with our first year university students where we would bring them in and we would show them a newspaper clipping. And that newspaper clipping would have a story which said researchers at Harvard Medical School had discovered that 80% of heroin addicts had drunk milk as children, and their view was that milk was a significant risk factor for heroin addiction. Now, the really worrying effect is that over half of first year university psychology students think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw from the data, which may reflect the fact that they're more impressed by the fact that the researchers came from Harvard than actually thinking about the problem. But nevertheless, that same error of logic, that as association is not causation, plagues the area of fatigue incident analysis. In many cases, we make exactly the same error. If the person was fatigued at the time of the accident, therefore the accident must have been fatigue related. And this isn't necessarily always the case. And I can illustrate this by giving you a very simple example. Imagine two people driving home after the first night of night shift. They're both extremely tired. They have a personal fatigue likelihood score of 14. And one car is T-boned by a drunk driver coming home from the pub at 6 o'clock in the morning. And the other person drifts off to the left on a slow curve on a country road and smashes into a tree with no braking and no corrective action. Both of those drivers were fatigued at the time of the accident, but you would probably conclude that the second driver was far more likely to be involved in a fatigue-related accident. Just because you're tired at the time of the accident doesn't mean it caused the accident. Despite what seems like simple, elegant logic, that mistake is made by accident investigators all the time. They assume that if you are fatigued at the time of the accident, it must be fatigue related. Now, you could probably put forward the argument if the driver coming home who'd been T-boned by the drunk driver had been more alert, they might have seen the drunk driver coming in their peripheral vision and might have been able to brake easier or faster or something like that. And there may be some argument to say that fatigue may have partially contributed. But in terms of determining that there was a significant probability that it was a fatigue-related accident, you'd be much more comfortable with assessing the second accident as a fatigue-related accident than the first one. So again, it's very important in terms of understanding the level 5 controls. You need to be able to go back and assess the level 1, 2 and 3 evidence suggesting the likelihood of an error, and you need to look at the level 4 data about the nature of the error that led to the accident. And both of those conditions need to hold true. There needs to be level 1, 2 and 3 evidence that the individual was likely to be fatigued, and you need to show that the error that caused the accident must be typical of a fatigue-related error. Okay, that takes us to the end of the content for this section of the course. And what I'd like to do is to spend a little bit of time reflecting on what we've gone through, what the implications of this are for you and for the organisations that you work within, and where we're going to go now in terms of the rest of the course. In terms of reflecting upon what we've looked at, you'll remember in the first part of the course we looked at the effects of fatigue, how fatigue affected cognitive functions. We then went on to look at the legal consequences of fatigue, in particular in terms of criminal, occupational health and safety and civil litigation. We then went on to look at how fatigue would be managed from a safety management systems perspective, and we took the work of Jim Reason and applied that to develop a very simple model of levels of control for how fatigue could be managed. After outlining the conceptual framework for those 5 levels of control, we then went through each of those levels of control and explained or described what could be simply referred to as the simple and the Rolls-Royce versions of controls at each of those levels. The challenge now for you doing this course is to think about the material that you've been presented, and when you see the assessment, you'll realise the assessment is to actually write a fatigue risk management policy for your organisation or for a theoretical organisation that we will identify for you. And the challenge for you is to go back and say, what can I do at each of those levels in my organisation? What would be the most appropriate way to implement controls at each of that level? And where is my level of maturity telling me that I am now as an organisation and where I intend to be in 6, 12, 18 or 24 months from now? The major part of the assessment will require you to write a fatigue management policy for either yours or a theoretical organisation. And the second part of the assessment exercise will get you to review and make recommendations on 2 of your colleagues' fatigue risk management systems. So the important point will be to reflect on both what are the tools and techniques that we have provided for you, but also to think about what are the strengths and limitations of each of those controls and the developmental trajectory that the organisation that you work for is on, or that the individuals that you are assessing their FRMS are on. There are no right answers to this question. The best FRMS will be one that takes the organisation as far as it can possibly go in the short term and then provides a clear, straightforward agenda for where it needs to go in the next 6, 12, 18 or 24 months, and provides clear milestones on how you will know that you are proceeding according to the plan. Similarly, when you're reviewing somebody's program, you will need to think about where it is they're coming from. Have they clearly identified the strengths and weaknesses of the organisation and the most appropriate ways of implementing controls at each of these levels? Enjoy the rest of the exercises in this program. There will be some short answer questions. There will be a more formal assessment whereby you write the FRMS and assess other people's FRMS. We will also ensure that questions on the content will be asked and answers will be recorded, so that as you and others go through this course, you will be able to go back and read or look at or listen to the questions that other people have asked, seeking clarification around certain questions that arose at different points in the lecture content. Hopefully some of this has been interesting for you. We're always interested in some feedback on how the course can be improved, how the content can be made more relevant, and what we can do to better support you and your organisation in developing your fatigue risk management systems.